The police officer humiliated an elderly woman in front of the courthouse without knowing she was the judge's mother. The scorching summer sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt in front of the imposing courthouse. The hot, heavy air seemed to swallow everything around it, creating a nearly suffocating atmosphere. In the midst of this blazing scene, a solitary, fragile figure stood out, making her way toward the steps of the building. Edith Johnson, a 78-year-old black woman, walked slowly. Each step she took seemed to require monumental effort, yet her posture remained upright. She wore a simple faded blue cotton dress, worn by time and use but impeccably clean and pressed. The straw hat perched on her head was old, with frayed edges, but her dignity was untouchable. In her calloused hands, she held a battered leather bag, carrying not only her belongings but also a life story filled with struggles, losses, and triumphs. Her eyes, framed by deep wrinkles that told decades of hard work, sparkled as she approached the courthouse. In them lay a mix of determination and anxiety. The movement in front of the courthouse was frantic. Lawyers in expensive suits rushed back and forth, carrying folders filled with documents. Journalists stood by, microphones and cameras in hand, ready to capture any snippet of news. Police officers patrolled the area, alert to even the slightest sign of trouble. Edith took a deep breath. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but something greater propelled her forward. Her eyes locked onto the steps leading into the courthouse. Each step toward that imposing building represented more than just a simple walk. It was a journey carrying decades of injustices she could no longer ignore. When Edith finally reached the base of the stairs, she began to ascend, taking small but firm steps. She had barely made it halfway when a harsh voice interrupted her progress. "Hey, you there!" The voice echoed loudly, authoritative. Edith paused and turned slowly. A young police officer, Brian Thompson, approached her with firm strides and a look of disdain on his face. He was no older than 30 but was already known for his arrogance and for mistreating those he deemed inferior. "Where do you think you're going, ma'am?" he asked, crossing his arms and sizing up Edith from head to toe. She kept her gaze calm, although she felt the weight of prejudice in the officer's words. "I'm going to the courthouse, sir," Edith replied, her voice serene yet filled with determination. Thompson smirked derisively, drawing the attention of onlookers. "To the courthouse?" He laughed, mocking the elderly woman. "And what could an old lady like you possibly have to do in there?" Curious gazes from lawyers and passers-by turned toward the scene, while Edith remained impassive. "I have my reasons, officer," she said calmly. "And I believe I have the right to enter a public building." "You're right." Thompson stepped forward, encroaching on Edith's personal space as if expecting her to back down. "Listen here, Grandma. This isn't a place for people like you. Why don't you go home and leave the serious business to those who understand it?" Some in the crowd exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others simply looked away, pretending not to witness the unfolding drama. But Edith didn't let it faze her. She stared back at Thompson, her eyes filled with dignity and strength. "With all due respect, officer, I believe you are making a mistake. You don't know me, you don't know who I am, and you have no right to judge me by my appearance." Thompson shook his head, visibly irritated by the old woman's response. He took another step closer, invading her personal space further, as if expecting her to cower. "Listen well," he said, his voice lowered but threatening. "If I say you can't go in, then you can't go in. Understood?" Before Edith could respond, a new voice, strong and authoritative, echoed down the courthouse steps. "What is happening here?" Everyone turned to see Judge Marcus Johnson, an imposing figure, descending the stairs with firm strides. His eyes swept the scene, momentarily fixing on Officer Thompson before softening as they landed on Edith. Edith broke into a small smile of relief upon seeing her son. Thompson, on the other hand, froze in place. He knew who Marcus Johnson was, the most respected judge in the courthouse, known for his integrity and rigor. "Judge, I Thompson began, stammering. This woman, the judge interrupted, pointing at Edith, is my mother. The revelation hit Thompson like a punch to the gut. His face paled, and his arrogant posture crumbled instantly. He stepped back, his eyes wide with disbelief. Your mother? He whispered, his voice trembling. The crowd around them held its breath. The journalists, who had previously only been observing, began to whisper among themselves, realizing that something much bigger was happening there. Cameras turned toward the police officer and the elderly woman, capturing every second of the scene. Thompson, now desperate to correct his behavior, stepped forward, raising his hands in a conciliatory gesture. Mrs. Johnson, I'm sorry. I didn't know. He began, his voice trembling. I made a terrible mistake. Please forgive me for my behavior. Edith remained silent for a few seconds, studying the officer's face. The people around her expected her to accept the apology, but what came next surprised everyone. You're apologizing just because you now know who I am? Edith asked, her voice calm but firm. That's not an apology, officer. That's fear. Fear of the consequences. Thompson was left speechless. The crowd murmured, and some reporters tried to move closer to capture the moment. What you did to me, Edith continued, now locking eyes with the officer, is something you've done to others, isn't it? Humble people whom you think don't deserve respect. But today that ends. The silence was broken by the flashes of cameras. The revelation that Edith was the mother of a judge, along with her courage in confronting Thompson, began to create a wave of repercussions. Reporters were already gathering, frantically jotting down their headlines. Officer humiliates judge's mother in public, or discrimination case shakes the courthouse. Thompson tried to stammer something, but the words wouldn't come. He knew he had been unmasked, but the worst was yet to come. Edith Johnson was not just an elderly woman walking up the courthouse steps. She was the reflection of a lifetime of silent struggles and quiet achievements. Her slow steps and dignified posture were, in fact, the result of years of battles that shaped her inner strength. Every wrinkle on her face, every callus on her hands, told a story. Edith grew up in a small town in the South, during the height of racial segregation. The daughter of sharecroppers, her parents worked hard to support the family in a world where discrimination was a daily reality. From an early age, Edith learned that the world would not be kind to her, not for something she did, but simply because of the color of her skin. She clearly remembered a hot afternoon, similar to that day in front of the courthouse, when she was about 8 years old. Her parents had taken her to the town market, where a silent segregation dominated the streets. The signs that read whites only, and the suspicious glances reminded her that she was unwelcome in many places. As her parents negotiated with the merchant, Edith held tightly to her mother's hand, who told her, "Never lower your head, my daughter. They may try to make you feel smaller, but you are just as worthy as any of them." Those words were etched in her mind forever. The dignity her mother taught her to uphold never left her, even in the most difficult moments. That strength she saw in her mother would guide her for the rest of her life, including in that moment, climbing the courthouse steps many years later. In the following years, Edith faced the harsh reality of growing up as a black woman in a world that insisted on underestimating her. Against all odds, she graduated from high school, a rare achievement for black women of her generation. With unwavering determination, Edith helped her parents with the farm during the day and studied at night by the light of a lamp. At 20, she met Charles Johnson, a passionate young civil rights activist. They married soon after, in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard. Charles shared Edith's determination to fight for a better world, and together, they became an unyielding force in their community. However, this struggle came at a price. During the height of the civil rights movement, Charles was arrested several times for organizing peaceful protests and demonstrations against segregation. Edith, despite the constant fear of losing her husband, stood by his side, supporting him and caring for their 2 young children. Marcus and his sister, Clara. When Marcus was born on a stormy night, Edith held her baby in her arms and felt a renewed hope for the future. She and Charles made silent promises to the little newborn that he would grow up in a different, fairer world. In the years that followed, Charles and Edith raised their children based on values of justice, equality, and respect for others, regardless of color, class, or status. Every dinner table conversation was a moral lesson, where young Marcus listened to stories of his father being dragged out of meetings by the police or of Edith facing employers who paid her less for her work simply because she was a black woman. These lessons shaped Marcus's character. He grew up witnessing his parents fight not just for themselves but for everyone around them. He saw the resilience of his mother, who even after Charles passed away young due to health issues exacerbated by his arrests, refused to be defeated. Edith, now a widow, carried the burden alone, but always with dignity. Charles's death was a devastating blow to the family. Edith was only 40 when she became a widow, and Marcus was 14. Still, she did not stop. Edith worked 2 jobs to ensure her children received a good education, something she and Charles had always valued. During the day, she cleaned houses, and at night, she cooked at a local diner. Even when exhausted, there was always time to sit with Marcus and Clara after school and ask about their day. She would review their homework, encourage them to dream big, and amidst her fatigue, she would say, "You can be whatever you want. The world may try to stop you, but never let it make you give up." And Marcus did not give up. He excelled in school and had a clear dream of becoming a lawyer, influenced by his parents' constant fight for justice. He knew that his mother, with so little, sacrificed everything for him and his sister, and that unwavering love and dedication propelled him forward. When Marcus was accepted into a prestigious law school, it was a proud moment for Edith. She remembered the words she had spoken when he was a baby, promising him a better future. Now, he was on his way to realizing that promise. She vividly recalled the day he left for college. With a proud smile on her face and tears in her eyes, she told her son, "Marcus, you are going to do what your father dreamed of. Never forget where you came from. And, more importantly, never forget why you are doing this." He nodded, with the same determined look he inherited from Edith and Charles. He knew that his future was not just for himself, but also a way to honor everything his parents had sacrificed. He was about to embark on a path of justice, and it was his mother's strength that guided him. Years went by, and Marcus became a successful lawyer and later one of the most respected judges in the state. Every time he made a decision in court, he remembered those nights at the dinner table with his mother, hearing about his parents' struggles. He understood that his responsibility as a judge was not just to the law, but to the people who relied on him to ensure that justice was served. Edith, for her part, never stopped standing by her son. At every important case, she was there in the front row, watching proudly as the man she had raised became a force for justice that she and Charles had always dreamed of. As Edith climbed the steps of the courthouse on that hot day, she reflected on the entire journey that had brought her there. The weight of the years and struggles did not prevent her from holding her head high. She knew that when facing Officer Thompson, she was not just fighting for herself, but for all those who, like her, had been oppressed and underestimated. When Thompson discovered that Edith was the mother of Judge Marcus Johnson, his demeanor changed instantly. Edith realized that this was not just a matter of personal dignity. Her fight at that moment was for something greater. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice, and now she would not back down. She was determined to use her voice and her position to help those who did not have the same privilege. Using her son's status as a judge was not a privilege she wanted to exploit for herself, but rather to expose injustices and ensure that others like her would no longer be victims of a corrupt and prejudiced system. In the days that followed, the incident gained traction in the media. Local television networks covered the story, highlighting not only Edith's public humiliation but also the fact that she was the mother of the most influential judge in the city. This increased the pressure on authorities to investigate Thompson's behavior. Edith was not only interested in her own justice. Now, using her influence as the mother of a judge and the attention the case had drawn, she began to seek justice for those who had been harmed by Thompson. "This isn't just about me," she told Marcus days after the incident. "This man has abused his power for too long, and many people haven't had the chance to defend themselves. I can't let this go." Marcus, sitting in his office, listened to his mother attentively. He had always respected her as a strong and fair woman, and he knew she was right. He sighed, realizing the pressure on him would be immense. As a judge, he would have to remain impartial, but as her son, he felt the weight of her words. "Mom, I know you want justice, and I do too," he said calmly. "But we need to do this the right way. Let's expose Thompson's history, and I promise he will be held accountable for everything he's done." Edith nodded, but before leaving the room, she cast a serious look at her son. "Remember, Marcus, why you're in this position. Your role isn't just to judge, but to ensure that justice reaches even the most humble. Never forget that." The investigation into Brian Thompson progressed rapidly. Daniel Martins, the lawyer who had helped Edith initially, joined her and the legal team handling the case. From testimonies and reports, they discovered that Thompson had been accused of misconduct multiple times, but the complaints had always been buried. "He didn't choose his victims randomly," Daniel explained to Edith. "They were all simple, humble people whom he knew wouldn't have the strength to fight back against the system. Now we have enough evidence to prosecute him." With the help of other attorneys, Edith and Daniel began organizing a class action lawsuit against Thompson. Numerous victims who had suffered abuses at the hands of the officer united for the case. There were stories of intimidation, racism, abuse of power, and even violence. Thompson was officially suspended from his duties while the case moved forward. The media, which had already been closely following the story, now focused even more on the allegations. Each new testimony against the officer became a headline, and soon Thompson's name became synonymous with abuse of power and corruption. Brian Thompson wasn't born a bad man, but over the years, the choices he made and the influences he encountered shaped his warped view of power and authority. He grew up in a small town, surrounded by authority figures he admired, eventually deciding to follow in his father's footsteps and join the police force. Brian's father, George Thompson, had been a police officer for over 30 years, a respected figure in town, though not always for the right reasons. George was tough, inflexible, and believed that maintaining order meant imposing respect, often through fear. He brought home stories from his job at the department, and young Brian grew up hearing his father's tales of keeping the town clean, especially by getting rid of those he deemed problematic. From an early age, Brian internalized this worldview. The poor, the marginalized, and racial minorities were seen as intruders in the order his father valued so much. George frequently referred to these groups in derogatory terms, and Brian grew to believe that those different from his own family were a threat to social balance. When Brian entered the police academy, he found himself in the environment he had always idealized. Young cadets like him admired the rigid and relentless demeanor of the older officers, and Brian quickly grasped how the power dynamic functioned within the institution. His main instructor, Sergeant Carl Simmons, was a figure who, in many ways, mirrored Brian's father. Simmons believed that respect could only be earned through force, which often meant going beyond what the rules allowed. In Simmons's words, "The law is what we say it is." Brian absorbed this lesson. He began to see police authority as a means of absolute control, where the law was not an ideal of justice but a tool to maintain the status quo. At the academy, Brian excelled not for his intelligence or compassion, but for his ability to control situations, which in reality meant dominating and intimidating. He quickly learned that his superiors valued him for his effectiveness in maintaining order on the streets, but that order gradually morphed into something darker. Brian began to stand out in the department by rigorously applying his vision of policing. In his early years as an officer, he already accumulated complaints of abuse, but these were often ignored or buried. In his mind, This only reinforced the idea that he was doing the right job. After all, no superior punished him for his actions. His violent behavior began to emerge within the first months of patrol. In an incident he always remembered with pride, Brian arrested a young black man for walking suspiciously in a predominantly white neighborhood. The young man did not resist, but Brian treated him as a threat from the start, pushing him against the wall and twisting his arms aggressively. When the young man tried to argue, Brian silenced him with cutting words. "People like you don't belong here," he said. Although the young man filed a formal complaint against Brian for abuse of power, nothing was done. The department quickly buried the case, claiming that Brian had acted in accordance with standard operating procedures. For Brian, that was proof that his policing methods were correct. The first signs that Brian was becoming a problem were ignored by his superiors. The police chief, Peter Randall, believed that men like Brian were necessary in an increasingly disordered world. To Randall, Thompson represented the type of officer who wasn't afraid to do the dirty work, the kind that other officers avoided. Chief Randall had a reputation for protecting his most loyal officers, and that included Brian. Whenever a complaint arose, be it for abuse of power, cruel treatment, or prejudiced behavior, Randall ensured that the files were filed away. In private meetings, he praised Brian, saying that he had a firm hand, and that the city needed more cops like him. Aware of the protection he received, Brian began to feel invincible. No complaint, no criticism seemed capable of taking him down. He continued to escalate his abuses, particularly against low-income individuals and minorities, knowing that these communities had little access to legal resources to fight back. His closest colleagues, who often disagreed with his actions, remained silent. Many of them did not want to clash with Randall, fearing for their own careers. There was a moment that could have been a turning point for Brian Thompson, but the system failed. He was involved in a particularly severe incident where he used excessive force against a Latina woman who was merely asking questions about a traffic ticket. The woman, 8 months pregnant, ended up in the hospital due to Thompson's violence. The situation generated a small uproar in the local media, with some journalists pressing the police department to explain why an officer like Brian was still on active duty. However, once again, Chief Randall intervened. The woman received a financial settlement in an out-of-court agreement, and Brian continued in his position without even a formal reprimand. Impunity continued to shape his personality. More and more convinced that he was above the law, Brian grew increasingly cruel in his approaches, especially with people who appeared humble. In his mind, he was fulfilling his duty, maintaining order, eliminating what he considered disturbers of the peace. Over time, Brian became closer to more corrupt circles within the police force. He began associating with a group of officers who, in addition to abusing their power, were also involved in illicit practices such as extortion and bribery. Although he never directly engaged in these crimes, Brian often covered for his colleagues' actions in exchange for favors. This made him part of the system, a cog in a machine of abuse and corruption that operated in the shadows. These corrupt officers, who controlled specific areas of the city, ensured that Brian was always protected in exchange for his silence and loyalty. He knew of the crimes happening right under his nose but preferred to ignore them, convinced that the police system needed these gray areas to function. As Brian continued his ascent within the department, the abuses became more frequent. But unlike other corrupt officers, he maintained a facade of legality. He was never directly associated with major crimes, but he used his authority to intimidate, extort, and coerce the most vulnerable. He didn't need bribes. His pleasure lay in control, in the absolute power he wielded over others. His trajectory led him to believe that the law was not something to be followed, but a weapon to be wielded at his convenience. Deep down, Brian saw himself as a defender of order, someone who kept society running by eliminating those he considered undesirable. He distanced himself from the notion of justice, preferring the idea of absolute control. When Thompson first saw Edith that day in front of the courthouse, He automatically categorized her as just another easy victim of his abusive practices. An elderly black woman with a simple appearance. To Brian, she represented exactly the kind of person he used to subjugate. But what he didn't know was that Edith was not just another victim. She was the mother of one of the most powerful and respected men in that courtroom. And, more importantly, she was not a woman who bowed down to oppression. The encounter with Edith marked the beginning of Thompson's downfall. The revelation that she was the mother of Judge Marcus Johnson exposed the fragility of his facade of invulnerability. For the first time, Thompson saw his world crumbling. All the complaints he thought he had buried began to resurface, and the protection of his superiors would no longer be enough to save him. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. Reporters and ordinary citizens filled the galleries, all eager to witness the outcome of a case that had shaken the entire city. At the center of it all, Edith remained serene, sitting beside Daniel. She knew this was a crucial moment not only for her but for all who had suffered at Thompson's hands. Judge Marcus Johnson, maintaining his professional demeanor, patiently listened to all the arguments and evidence against the officer. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Thompson's victims took turns sharing their testimonies. The stories of abuse were disturbing, and some of the victims wept as they relived the traumas they had endured. When it was Thompson's turn to speak, he attempted to defend his actions, claiming he was merely doing his duty. But the weight of the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his arguments sounded hollow. In the end, the verdict was clear. Thompson was found guilty of abuse of authority, discrimination, and violence. In addition to prison time, he permanently lost his job as a police officer. The system that had protected him for so long had finally held him accountable. After the trial, Edith left the courtroom accompanied by Daniel. The crowd that had gathered outside applauded as she passed by. Edith had become a symbol of resistance and justice for many in the city. "You did it, Edith," Daniel said with a smile. "Justice has been served." She returned his smile, but with the serenity of someone who knows that the fight for justice never truly ends. "It wasn't just me, Daniel," she replied. "It was everyone who had the courage to stand up to this system. And, more importantly, it's because of the people who never gave up the fight." As they walked down the sidewalk, the sun, which had previously beaten down on the courthouse, now seemed to shine more gently. The city had changed a little that day, and hopefully, it would change even more in the future. And Marcus, watching his mother from the courtroom window, smiled. He knew there was something greater at work in the job he did, and for all the importance of his role as a judge, it was his mother's example that reminded him every day of the true meaning of justice. Brian Thompson had lost everything. The courtroom was silent, but the echo of the sentence seemed to reverberate inside him like thunder. He, who for so long had felt untouchable, was now just a shattered man, condemned for abuses he once considered normal. The authority he had always flaunted had vanished, and with it, all the pride and arrogance that had sustained his identity. Judge Marcus Johnson had been relentless in his sentencing, but fair. He had given Thompson the opportunity to speak in his defense, but the evidence was overwhelming. Deep down, Thompson knew he deserved what was happening to him. The system that had protected him for so long could no longer hide the truth. Brian Thompson's arrest was not a grand event. He was escorted out of the courtroom in silence, without the protests or resistance many had expected. For the first time in years, Brian felt empty, devoid of the shield of arrogance that had always protected him from any introspection. As he was placed in a cell, he realized something he had never admitted to himself. He was alone. During the first few days, he tried to maintain the facade of a tough guy, refusing to acknowledge the weight of his actions. But the nights in prison were relentless. Without the distraction of work and without the sense of power he had cultivated for years, Thompson was forced to confront the reality of his situation. While in his cell, flashes of his life began to emerge in his mind. He remembered when he was a young police officer, filled with hope and pride in following in his father's footsteps. He recalled the first time he received a badge and the sense of responsibility that came with it. Back then, many years ago, Brian believed being a police officer meant protecting people, especially the vulnerable. But at some point, he had lost that ideal. Brian remembered his father, George Thompson, always talking about how cruel the world was and how they, as police officers, needed to be even tougher to maintain order. He grew up believing in that. His father had been a powerful influence, and Brian wanted to be like him. But now, from inside his cell, he began to question those teachings. His father wasn't there. None of his superiors were. He was alone, facing the consequences of his own choices. A few days after his arrest, Thompson received an unexpected visitor. It wasn't one of his lawyers or his family, whom he had lost touch with long ago. It was Edith Johnson, the woman who had inadvertently started his downfall, but in a way, had also freed him from the false armor he had been wearing. Edith entered the small visiting room, and Thompson felt a mix of shame and surprise at seeing her. He hadn't expected her to come. Sitting behind a metal table, he raised his eyes slowly to meet Edith's calm gaze. She sat down across from him, without a trace of resentment on her face. "What are you doing here?" Thompson asked, his voice faltering slightly. It was the first time he had spoken in days. "I came to see if you're okay," Edith said, her voice steady and firm. Brian was taken aback. See if he was okay? He, the man who had publicly humiliated her? He had expected confrontation, maybe insults, but not this. She continued to surprise him. "I don't deserve this," he whispered, looking down. "What I did. You have no idea how many people I hurt." Edith nodded slightly. "I know what you did, Brian. But we all have the power to choose what we do with our mistakes. You still have a choice." Thompson shook his head, still unable to grasp how she could speak to him that way. "And what do you think I should do now?" he asked, his voice heavy with regret. "I've lost everything. No one is going to forgive me for this." "It's not about the forgiveness of others," Edith said, with a gentle but firm tone. "It's about you. You need to forgive yourself, and that starts with acknowledging what you've done and committing to never be that man again." Brian looked at her, still incredulous at the patience and strength of that woman. For years, he had believed that power meant control, fear, brute strength. But, sitting across from Edith, he saw something much more powerful: dignity, wisdom, and compassion. After that visit, something changed in Brian Thompson. Prison, once a place of anguish and frustration, became a sort of refuge for reflection. It wasn't a pleasant place, but here he found a space where he could finally confront his demons. He began to remember all the faces of the people he had harmed, people he had humiliated, whom he had treated as inferior. These memories were painful, but for the first time, Brian allowed himself to feel them. He was no longer the man protected by his badge. He was no longer the cop who had power over others. He was just a man confronting his mistakes. Slowly, he began to accept the truth. The truth that for years, he hadn't protected and served society, as he promised when he became a police officer. Instead, he had protected his own ego, serving only his desire for control. A month after his sentencing, Brian decided to write a letter. He felt he needed to express his feelings in some way, even if no one read it. Sitting in his cell, with a piece of paper and a simple pen, he began to write. The letter wasn't for his family, nor for his former colleagues, but for Edith. He wrote about his childhood, about how he was influenced by his father and his superiors. He admitted that he had strayed from the path and that, at some point, he had stopped being the officer he dreamed he would be. The words were difficult but necessary. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "Edith, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know what I did is unforgivable. But I want you to know that your dignity and strength made me see something I hadn't seen in a long time. I'm still not the man I want to be, But because of you, I will try. I know it will be a long journey, but I'm willing to start." Brian didn't know if Edith would read the letter, but for him, writing it was already a first step. For the first time in years, he felt he could try to become a better person. Not for glory or power, but simply for himself. The days that followed were slow and challenging for Brian. The reality of prison still weighed heavily on him, but in a way, he accepted it. He knew he deserved to be there. Yet, at the same time, he knew that this place would not be his end. Thompson began to read more, educating himself on issues he had previously ignored or distorted. He signed up for rehabilitation programs and began working towards what could be his personal redemption. Other inmates no longer saw him as the arrogant cop he once was. Some still despised him, but he didn't care. For the first time, Thompson was learning to face the consequences of his actions without hiding behind a facade of power. He didn't know what the future held. He understood he would never regain his position or the respect he once had in the police force, but that didn't concern him anymore. What mattered now was the possibility of change, of becoming someone better than he had been. Perhaps one day, he thought, he would find a way to make amends to the people he had harmed. And even if that was never possible, he was determined to never be that man again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more scripts full of emotion and twists. Share your thoughts in the comments and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any updates. Here's a question for you. What would you do if you were in Edith's shoes? Would you trust the justice system, or would you take a different approach? We want to hear your opinion. Sure. Please provide the text you would like me to translate, and I'll be happy to assist you.